Hi there, I'm Robert Tercek. As the National Science Foundation contemplates the rollout and expansion of a national innovation network, it's useful to think about all the ways we share information. It's my belief that the way we share and communicate information shapes society. In this series of videos, we're going to take a look at that. You're about to see an excerpt from a talk that I did in Washington, where I talked about a concept called the knowledge network. In this first section, I'll explain what I mean by the knowledge network, and we'll take a look at an example from the 19th century of a knowledge network that sort of worked haphazardly but didn't quite work. And then we'll take a look at the ways technology are helping people scale knowledge networks so that they can work at enormous numbers of people. So watch this clip. I really believe that the exchange of information, the way we exchange information, shapes the future trajectory for society. Society is a conversation. History and culture are a conversation. One set of ideas is proposed, they're adopted, another set of ideas happens in opposition or exchange, and so forth. That ricochets throughout history, and I'll show you some examples of that. I thought I'd start by just taking a baseline. It's interesting to note that this year, we celebrate the 45th anniversary of the internet, the 40th anniversary of the PC. It's true. Back in 1975, two guys named Steve in a garage in Cupertino started the Apple computer, and a guy named Bill Gates started writing software for the IBM PC. And the World Wide Web itself is 25 years old at this point. So these are technologies that have been around for quite a while. And yet the information age has barely begun. It's barely begun because the first 20 or 30 years were really infrastructure, laying down the networks, getting the computers to actually run, miniaturization, and so forth. And the last 10 or 15 years has been about building the communications protocols and technologies on top of that network so that we can exchange information. So really all we've been doing is laying foundation for the last 40 or 45 years. We've barely begun. A client of mine asked me recently, their big media company, agency in New York, they said, what are the trends we need to be aware of for the next 5 years? What are the most important trends? And I said, that's an easy question to answer. It's easy to answer because all you have to do is take everything that's happened in the last 40 years in the information industry, in the IT industry, and apply it to everything else. And so any business that involves geography, and that could be logistics, transportation, it could be involving warehousing or the shipping of product supply chains and so forth, that's being transformed by information. Biology is being transformed right now. Biology, any business that involves biology is now becoming an information business, and that could be pharmaceutical, it could become agriculture, healthcare, and so forth. Even manufacturing, with robotics and in the not too distant future, nanotechnology, those fields too will be transformed. So we're in this era now where information is reshaping the world that we live in. It's truly transforming it before our eyes. Some amazing breakthroughs are starting to happen as we combine information science with some traditional businesses. Manufacturing, for instance, has been transformed completely by robotics in the last 25 years. We're starting to see robots now, the kind of classic science fiction version of a humanoid robot. That's no longer fiction. Those are starting to happen. They're starting to become household appliances. In some cases, robots like Jibo and Amazon's new robot toy that they've introduced. Starting to see robots that drive around, fly in the sky, robot drones, and robot spacecraft. And that enables entirely new businesses. I know of two people now that are backing ventures. I know two people personally backing ventures for asteroid mining with robots, which is kind of crazy. This is the stuff of science fiction just 20 years ago, but now it's being made possible because information technology combined with transportation and space logistics is making that possible. We're also starting to combine these robots with ourselves in new forms of prosthetic devices. Some people are starting to envision new superpowers for human beings based on robotics. And of course, once you've got robots that can move and walk, you're going to have pole dancing robots as well, something I'm personally not necessarily excited about. The robotic revolution isn't limited to manufacturing or transportation. It actually affects many other businesses. There's a new concern many people have expressed, which is that white-collar workers are going to be replaced by robots. It's already starting to happen. I spoke to the editor of a national newspaper chain about the robots like narrative science. It's an automated tool that can write newspaper stories, sports stories, box office scores, the information about the stock market, weather reports. In Los Angeles, a robot wrote the first story about an earthquake that we had not too long ago. I asked him if that was a concern, and he said, are you kidding? It's great news. In the newsroom, we've laid off so many editors, we've cored out the newsroom, that I can use all the help I can get. So if I have a robot writing the mundane stories, I can put human workers on the more interesting journalism tasks that require investigation and reporting and so forth. So we see this then as perhaps a way to augment human skills. And I think the advent of on-demand artificial intelligence is also going to do that. Some people are concerned. There's a real fear that that's going to displace workers, but other people are quite hopeful because they think it's going to augment humans and give them great power. The changes I'm talking about aren't limited to those manual tasks or white-collar tasks. The science, genomic science, has also become an information science. It's actually transforming all of biology into information science. I know there are folks in your network that are already working on using genetic sequencing and synthetic biology to reprogram biology at the cellular level. I think this is one of the most exciting fields with some of the greatest promise for us in the next 20 years, because we can start to use the power of biology, the power of nature, but we can redirect it in ways, in this example, to generate synthetic fuel or designer fuel. Already, most of the fleets that fly in North America use some form of fuel that's been generated through genetically programmed biology, typically algae. Another field that got a lot of hype a couple of years ago is 3D printing. 3D printing seemed sensational. The idea at the time was desktop publishing changed the world of print in the 1980s, so perhaps desktop manufacturing will change the world of supply chains and retail and so forth. Perhaps people will start to make their own things at home. That vision has not manifested. That was a little bit of hype, I think. I think what most people find when they get one of these things is it's actually kind of a finicky hobbyist device, a 3D printer. You have to maintain the thing, clean it, take a lot of care of it. That makes it actually kind of awkward to use for most people. So it's probably better to think of this particular technology that for the home is still in the stage of the computer hobby back in the 1970s. You know, before personal computers were standardized and manufactured, people made them themselves, and it was very much a hobbyist genre. I think that's sort of where we are with home 3D printing today. It's still hobbyist, but there's tremendous changes happening in other fields because of 3D printing. One of the most exciting ones is in medical technology now, where the 3D printing of bones and skin tissue is actually quite common. That's becoming commonplace. That's becoming a standard procedure. This is a human jaw. We're starting to see designs and prototypes for human organs that have been printed on 3D printers, replacement organs. They predict that by 2020, we'll be able to make a human heart. I guess the point I'm trying to make now is that if you can envision it, it's actually possible to build it. We're going to live through a time where any idea you might conceive of can be built. That's an exciting time. The way you'll find out about ideas is through a knowledge network. And that's the real thrust of my talk today. A knowledge network, simply defined, is how people are connected to ideas. We have more ways to do that today than ever before in history. So many ways to do it. Certainly you can connect through other people. That's one great way to find out new ideas. You can also do it through products, through places, institutions, companies, and probably most importantly, through media. These are all ways to extend our ability to communicate an idea from one person to another. That's why I'm excited about the National Innovation Network, because I think this is the most important thing that humans do. I think this is at the core of society, at the core of our economy, is about the exchange of ideas. Let me illustrate it with an example from the past. Little question: which Victorian scientist spent years at sea collecting specimens to prove his theories, was credited with the discovery of natural selection? That's a pretty big clue. Credited with the discovery of natural selection, and then was awarded the highest honors in British science. And so if you're not a biologist, if you're a biologist, you're going to know the answer to this. Most people would arrive at the conclusion Charles Darwin. It seems like the obvious choice, and he wouldn't necessarily be wrong. But the person I'm thinking of is actually not Darwin. It's the other person who shares credit for natural selection, and that would be Wallace, his counterpart. And Wallace, the story is actually quite an interesting story. In 1858, Charles Darwin got a package of letters and an article that was written by Wallace. Wallace at the time was suffering from malaria on an island in Indonesia where he'd been gathering samples. He had met Darwin a few years earlier, prior to his trip. They exchanged ideas. They were both aware they were interested in exploring similar concepts. But during this sort of fever mode, when he had malaria, Wallace wrote down all of his ideas. In one coherent article, sent it off to Darwin and said, "Tell me what you think." Darwin saw it and was shocked, because he'd been working on the concept of natural selection for more than 20 years at that point, and had been assiduously gathering evidence. And he was stunned, because here he saw someone else had come out with almost a complete synthesis of his idea, and so he was quite concerned. And at the time, he was going through a family crisis as well, and so he didn't know what to do, so he sent everything over to the Linnean Society, where he was a member. And the folks of the Linnaean Society looked at this and they said, well, gosh, good for Darwin. He's got the integrity to forward this information. He could have pretended he didn't get it. He could have destroyed the article. He could have said, oh, maybe the ship sank or the mail got lost. It was 1858 after all. But he didn't do that. He had the integrity to send it across. And the folks of the Linnaean Society said, well, hang on. Before we publish this and give the credit to Wallace, we should really also give credit to Darwin, because he too has written. And so they gathered some of his articles and some of his writings, and they published both things at the same time and gave primary credit to Darwin. His name was first. And by the way, some people speculate that Wallace was upset about this. That's not true. They were friends until death throughout their lifetime. And Wallace always said that the most important thing he did in his career was by sending that article, he spurred Charles Darwin to finish his great treatise on the origin of species, which was published a year later, and that's really what solidified Darwin's reputation. It wasn't this set of articles that came out quickly. Now, what's interesting about this story is the way that it came about, how it was published, and the role that the Linnaean Society had in kind of being the arbiter who should get credit for this science. At the time, both Darwin and Wallace were puzzled because they couldn't figure out the mechanism whereby genetic mutations were handed down from one generation to the next. They couldn't identify it. Darwin had some theories. He had an idea that little particles from every cell would be transmitted to the sex cells in some fashion. That didn't pan out. He couldn't figure it out. And what's interesting to me in the context of today's conversation is that the answer was already known at the time, in 1858. The answer was already known. It had been found by this obscure monk in Austria, Gregor Mendel, who was very shy, and he didn't consider himself a scientist, although he was quite good at crossbreeding. And he's the person who identified how recessive and dominant traits work in genetic science. He's really the father of genetic science, but he never published his findings. He did keep assiduous notes, but they weren't found until 15 years after his death in 1899. So at the exact same time that Wallace and Darwin were working on the concept of speciation and evolution, at the exact same time, the genetic mechanism was being discovered, but there was no way at the time for this information to be shared. They had no knowledge network. You could say they had a broken knowledge network. Darwin was on the inside. He was part of the Linnaean Society. He was known to the other members. He had integrity. He was trusted. Wallace was on the outside, but he had a connection. He knew Darwin, so he got inside the circle. Mendel's outside. He didn't know anybody, so he was outside the circle, and as a result, his information wasn't shared. And it was almost 50 years later that the information came to light, so quite a long time. Imagine how things would have unfolded differently if Darwin could have corresponded with Mendel. Think about the difference there. We would have probably had 50 years advance in the discovery of genetics and how evolution actually works. So one of the recommendations I would make is you design your network is to design for inclusion. Don't exclude groups. Don't exclude people who might be geographically apart. It's a national network, but why make it national? Why limit it to that? Why not open it up to other networks, other innovation networks outside the United States? That's the first idea that I would share with you. You see, at the heart, a knowledge network is really a human network. It's a way to connect people together so that those people can share ideas together. In digital networks, we tend to refer to Metcalfe's law when we talk about connecting people together. Metcalfe's law says that the value of the network is the equivalent of the square of the number of users. And what that basically means in plain English is the more people who are connected, the more valuable the network is. You know this from your own personal experience. But some people question the value of this. They say, well, it's not really a law. One example here is Paul Krugman in the 1990s. He was very skeptical about all the internet hype bubble at the time. And he said there's a flaw in Metcalfe's law. He says the flaw in the law is that most people have nothing to say to each other. We don't share any information. We're not going to connect with more people than we already know because there'll just be a lot of noise. And actually, in a way, he missed the point. People do have a lot to say to each other. It's just not a lot of it is very meaningful. And so you have tremendous amounts of information being shared at huge velocities. And every year you see a chart like this that just shows you the staggering number of connections that we make and the sheer volume of information. And of course, this number goes up and doubles pretty steadily. Every 2 years, all of these numbers begin to double. And so we're exchanging millions and billions of messages and ideas with each other all the time. So I would say that Krugman was wrong in the idea that we don't have anything to say to each other. But he was right in one respect, which is that this leads us to the opposite problem. It's not that we don't have enough to say to each other. We have too much, far too much. Information overload. How do you sort out the wheat from the chaff? How do you find the signal from the noise? A sociologist named Robin Dunbar studied tribal connections and found that after the number of about 150, tribes start to break into two groups. And he came to the conclusion that human beings can only manage about 150 to 250 stable relationships. In other words, we can only manage to know about 150 people. And after that, we kind of tap out. Our brains can't compute more. So literally, the thing, in his theorizing, that limits our ability to make connections is the human neocortex, our ability to cognitively manage more than 150 relationships. That's the cap on how many relationships we can have. So you get this interesting situation then in digital networks where the value of the network goes up as you add more people. That's Metcalfe's law. That's the green line that goes up and to the right. And as you can see, that increases exponentially, as it should. But Dunbar's number imposes a limitation there. That's the red line that sort of flatlines out after about 150. And that yellow bit, well, that's the gap. That's the delta between Metcalfe's law and Dunbar's number. Now, that sounds like a limitation. That's where Paul Krugman was going with his skepticism about the internet, but he missed the point. What he didn't realize is that's an opportunity. That yellow area is an opportunity for digital network. In the last 10 years, the really main thrust of almost all the innovation that's happening in consumer internet services has been to solve this problem. How do you manage more than 150 connections with people who you'd like to know, but you can't fit one more person into your brain? Well, we outsource to software. It's a perfect job for software. So if you've ever wondered why Facebook and the many companies they've acquired, Instagram, and the chat services and so forth, why are these things so valuable? That's because they're riding that exponential curve up. As we connect with more and more people, we can't manage that in our own minds, so we outsource the cognitive load to Facebook, to Twitter, and so forth. And what we've also learned in the last 10 years is that this is a winner-take-all process. So the system that does this most efficiently for us, the system that enables us to manage more connections more efficiently than anyone else, once you're plugged into that network, you really don't have a need for a second one. And that's also true for the people that we connect with. And so in a way, Metcalfe's law applies to every social network that we connect with. Every time we join a new social service of some sort, Metcalfe's law goes into effect. The more people that join, the more valuable it becomes for everybody. And the less you need a second one. And you tend to have a winner-take-all effect. And so we've seen that happen again and again in the past 10 years. This is a part that I think is really relevant as you build out a national innovation network. Hi, Robert Tercek here again, and we're continuing in the series of videos on the subject of the knowledge network for the NSF's rollout of the National Innovation Network. In this section, we're going to take a look at the way information used to travel by foot. It wasn't necessarily the most efficient way to move goods or services, but it certainly became an effective way over time to move ideas, and those ideas transformed the world. So take a look at this next section, and you'll start to see that the way we share information from one society to another, from one group of people to another, can actually transform the world. Because I want to go back a little bit back in time to think about how is it that we arrived at a situation where Darwin, Wallace, and Mendel couldn't connect. How did we arrive at that situation? You have to go back in time a little bit, and you have to go to a little bit south. Now we're going to go to Istanbul. If you can talk about Istanbul, one of my favorite cities in the world to visit. People always say, well, it's the meeting point of East and West. It's where Europe meets Asia. That's true. Here you can see a satellite photo of the Bosphorus. On the left, you've got the European side. On the right, you've got the Asian side. But that photograph doesn't really tell you what's happened. For that, you have to get on the ground. When you go to Istanbul, it becomes very, very clear that Istanbul is an important node in the network. Istanbul is the meeting point of cultures, but it's also the meeting point of many other things. It's a transactional marketplace. And when you go through the Grand Bazaar or the spice market, you see these people who are incredibly skilled at instantly establishing rapport with a stranger. As you walk through, they'll shout out at you, American, German, British, like they're just trying everything until they find a connecting point. And then as soon as you tell them where you're from, they say, oh, I have a cousin in California. He lives in San Jose. They BS you, and they try to sell you something like spice or some carpets or something. But this marketplace notion, I think, is really a valid one. And I think Istanbul is a great illustration. Markets are at the core of a network. We tend to put too much emphasis on the network, the idea that there are people connected. That's great, but what's really at the core of it is the switchboard, where the ideas exchange happens. That's where the value control points are. That's what can be valuable for this National Innovator Network that you're building. I'm going to give you a little historical background on this. So there are two Roman emperors that you need to know. Before the current administration in Turkey today named the city Istanbul, it used to be known as Constantinople. That's Emperor Constantine on the right side. And on the left side is Emperor Justinian. And Constantine built the city. Justinian built things like this, the Hagia Sophia, one of the most amazing buildings in the world, kind of the pinnacle of Roman architecture, a design that's influenced almost every mosque in the Middle East, built as a Christian church. He also built the cisterns underneath the city, so if you go to Istanbul, you'll take a tour of these things underground. So quite a visionary guy, Justinian, with a big plan. But he had a problem on his hands. He was fighting wars. He was trying to retake the Western Roman Empire, which had fallen at that point. This is, we're talking about the mid-6th century. So it had fallen to Huns, and he had two armies fighting, and he was trying to regain that ground. And for that, he needed gold, but gold was ebbing out of the Roman Empire at this point because there was a mania. There was a silk mania happening in the Roman Empire. People were crazy about silk. If you think about the alternatives to silk that people had for clothing, it's not so surprising that anyone who could afford it was trading up and buying silk. When you see a statue with that flowing drape, that's not linen that they're wearing. That's not some rough woven wool garment that they're wearing. That's typically silk. But the silk wasn't made in Rome. The Emperor Constantine had made Rome, not just moved Rome to Istanbul, but he'd also turned the Roman Empire into a Christian empire. And all those priests and bishops, they also needed silk garments as well. So it wasn't just for the ladies. Everybody wanted to wear silk garments at this time in the Byzantine Empire. And so there's huge demand for silk, but it was a mystery fabric. Nobody knew where it came from. They knew it came from a country in the East. They knew the process for making it was a secret. And what the Romans thought was that perhaps silk was some kind of fuzz that grew on a tree, and you would go out and scrape it off of the leaves in the morning when the dew was just right. You could scrape it off. That was their concept, this sort of folklore idea of it. Well, Constantine didn't have any time for this because he was losing gold. Gold was moving east. Silk was coming in. He needed the gold to fight his war. And so he came up with an idea. He invented industrial espionage. What he decided to do was send some of his monks, some of his Christian monks, to the east. And they traveled all the way across this vast wasteland. They had to go through gigantic mountain passes in the Himalayas. They had to cross huge, vast deserts. They passed through some legendary cities like Samarkand and Khiva, cities that hadn't been visited before. And they even went through the Tamerlane Desert, which is in the middle of China. It's in the western part of China. It's a desert that's known to swallow entire cities whole. So they passed through all these hazards. They finally made their way to China, where they learned how silk was manufactured. And to their surprise, they learned it was made by worms. And the worms fed on a special diet of mulberry leaves. And then they were placed in these places to molt and grow. And as they did so, the silk they manufactured could be harvested. Now, the key to silkworms was getting the eggs of the silkworms. But this process was secret. The Chinese had guards everywhere. They didn't want this information to leak out. It was a source of great wealth for the Chinese Empire. And so the monks that were sent by Justinian had to smuggle them out in a cane. And this is a story of like early industrial espionage. They made their way all the way back across all of Asia, a journey of thousands of miles. It took more than a year at the time. So they were gone for years, and by the time they came back, Justinian himself was an old man. Today, outside of Istanbul, to this day, they're manufacturing silk. So the espionage worked. They managed to get the information out of China and bring it all the way back. I call this the Byzantine internet. It's sort of like a very slow motion version of exchanging ideas. It took years. A couple of points about it. The first one is actually China's pretty good at managing intellectual property when they're serious about it. They managed to keep silk under wraps for about 2,000 years. So when they're determined to keep a secret, they know how to do it. And before we accuse China of violating people's intellectual property with piracy, remember that the Romans started this a couple thousand years ago. I think on a digital network in particular, but any network that's open, if your strategy to keep your information under control is to withhold it and secure it, that strategy is doomed to fail. It simply won't work. Someone sooner or later is going to find a way to chisel in there, break it apart. And once the information is out, it's out. And then it's going to be out for good. We live in an era today where it's not just the NSA that's collecting your secrets. There are dozens of companies out there that are in the business of making your secrets available. Here's a funny cartoon that compares Julian Assange to Mark Zuckerberg. But actually, there are thousands of companies, data scrapers, data brokers that gather up your data on the internet and share it. So we're in an era where really the idea of secrecy as a strategy is doomed to fail. When we compare digital goods or information goods to physical goods, we start to see there's some important attributes, very different attributes of how these things work. So they travel on the exact same network, and they're exchanged sometimes in the exact same way, in the exact same context. But information goods operate completely differently. They travel much faster, and they last much longer. All the silk and spice and gold that was traded on the Silk Road, that's long gone. But many of the ideas I'm about to show you have lasted for hundreds of years. So the ideas last longer. They travel faster, last longer. They also evolve and grow. It's additive. You can contribute to those ideas. You can improve them. I'll show you an example of that in a second. And information is a non-rival good, which means that I can have all the information and give all of it to you, and I don't lose a thing. I can continue doing what I'm doing. I haven't really lost anything in the process by giving it to you. In fact, we both grow richer. And ultimately, information makes a much greater impact on society. A good way to think of this is to think of other information that traveled, other things that traveled on the Silk Route. One of them is religion. I was quite astonished to see that major religions, Buddhism, followed the path of the Silk Road. So that map of the spread of Buddhism across the top of the Himalayas there, that's exactly the route that the traders took on the Silk Route. The same thing is true on the western end. The spread of Christianity occurred along the route of the Silk Road. And the same thing is true later in 600, 700 with the spread of the Islamic religion. They too followed that route. It's not a surprise. This is quite obvious in retrospect. You look back, because what would happen is travelers would come into a city, as a foreign city. They had all their stuff with them, all their values, all the valuable things that they had with them on their camels or horses or whatever dray animal they had. And they'd walk into the strange town. The first thing you'd want to do is find someone who shares your values, someone that you can connect with. Who do you trust in the city where you're a total stranger? And so it makes great sense, I think, that the idea of religion would start to spread, grow, and prosper, because you're connecting people and ideas together as you move from town to town. So trust is at the core of the knowledge network. I bring this up because this is important right now. We're living at a time, strangely, in the United States, where we're the most technologically advanced society in the world, and yet trust in science is at an all-time low. I find this a very peculiar thing, and so one of the things I'm going to urge you to consider is how to rebuild trust in science, how to do that with human relationships. How might we use this National Innovation Network to reestablish trust in science? Now, so far I've been making this sound like all the good stuff was going to China. That's not quite true. Some of the great ideas came the other direction from China. 4 great inventions that transformed the world. This is the power of a knowledge network. First one was gunpowder. The Chinese invented gunpowder. Some people say, well, it was just for fireworks, but that's not true. The Chinese had all sorts of rockets, flaming arrows, and primitive grenades or mortars that they could shoot. They didn't really quite figure out the mix. That was the job of the alchemists. So when the information on how to make gunpowder came to the West, the alchemists perfected it, and then gradually saw a rapid series of innovations, how to make granular, stable forms of gunpowder, how to encase them in shells, how to improve cannons, such that by the mid-1600s, a way of life that had been around for 1,000 years, living in a fortified city or inside of a fortified castle, that came to an end. That era completely came to an end. This is Heidelberg, where I studied a long time ago, and that castle dominates the town, but the French army came in and blew it up, and so they had perfected gunpowder at that point. And it brought that whole chivalric age to an end, and it replaced it with an age of mechanized warfare, and much larger empires became possible, and that's all a function of an invention from China that traveled the Silk Route, came to the West, was perfected by alchemists in the form of gunpowder. It transformed the old order and created a new modern order. Another idea that traveled that way was the compass. We tend to think of a compass looking like this. The Chinese compass looked a bit more like this, as a magnetized spoon on a metal surface. At any rate, the concept was unknown in the West. Once they found that idea, again, perfected the idea of a compass in the West, it opened up an entirely new age, the age of discovery and the ability to sail beyond the shore and start to find new worlds, the New World in particular, the Americas. So it opened up the age of discovery. The very kinds of places where Alfred Russel Wallace, Charles Darwin went and explored and made their discoveries, that age of discovery was made possible by a Chinese invention that made its way across the Silk Road. One more set of inventions, paper making, which was perfected in the East, replaced parchment, which was used generally as sheepskin parchment that was used for documents in the West. And movable type was invented in China as well, usually for a form of block printing for textiles, also used for books. The Chinese did not invent metal typefaces, movable type. That was the job of Gutenberg and inventors in the West. So they took the Chinese idea and they modified it, improved it, invented it, and we had information products for the very first time with the ability to mass manufacture a book. Really, the book is the first mass manufactured product, so it opens up this era of mass manufacturing in society. But again, that was a Chinese invention that made its way across and utterly transformed the world. The function of the book is that it accelerates into innovation. It made possible the scientific process. You could have two people in two different places reading the exact same text. That was a first. That had never been possible before in history. And so that's the byproduct of the book. Hi, Robert Tercek, and this is the third and last segment of the video resource that we prepared to talk about the Knowledge Network in conjunction with the National Science Foundation's National Innovators Network. In this section, what we're going to do is talk about things that are happening right now, technologies that are available today that really recast the Knowledge Network, make it run on a digital network. And with that, you can transform everything. You can reach more people in more places simultaneously all over the world with the Knowledge Network. There's really no limitation anymore. Take a look at the way technologies will cause us to reconsider and rethink of the way we understand knowledge networks today. Now we stand at the brink of this digital era. We're entering this information age. As I said, we've spent the last 40 years laying the infrastructure, and now we're going to start to migrate all those processes, all those habits of mind that we have over to this digital network. And I think that's going to be transformative because it's going to greatly increase the speed and scale with which we can share ideas and information. When you think of a digital network, think about a telephone network. It's the best model. The best model for it, because at the heart of a telephone network, the valuable thing in a telephone network isn't the wires, not the phones at the end of the line. It's the switchboard. That's the place of control. That's the place where you can make the real value happen by connecting two parties together. And when you think about your National Innovation Network, think about it as a kind of switchboard, because every successful business on the internet is a switchboard, connecting a buyer and seller, connecting someone who's seeking something with someone who's providing it. It might be a search on YouTube. I'm seeking information. I go to Google, or I go to YouTube. I type in the thing I'm seeking, and then I'm connected with a provider who's got the information. It might be a product, in which case I'd probably go to Amazon. It might be information that's more of an encyclopedic nature. Then I might go to Wikipedia. But in every case, every single one of these sites operates like a kind of switchboard. It's an exchange point where there are people on one side who are providing the information or the product I seek, and people on the other side who are seeking it. And they provide the most efficient mechanism for matching them together. So we now have marketplaces that have emerged digitally for information, for identity, for your attention, for your relationships. That's what a social network is. So the medium itself is a market. And when you think about your National Innovation Network, think about market dynamics at the core. What are people seeking? What information are they seeking? Who's going to provide it? How is value exchanged? How is value captured in that network? Of course, today, the market comes with you everywhere you go. With mobile, we're able to do this on the fly. We've seen this incredible shift in the last 10 years. Miniaturization and increase in computing power have made it possible for us to bring a microcomputer with us everywhere we go, travel. And so we have that information at our fingertips now. So we're at a point where everyone's going to have this information available to them. And this information spans every kind of boundary. So in the past, those knowledge networks I described, for instance, the Linnaean society, they were bounded by geography, they were bounded by language, they were bounded by technology. We're now in a world where there are no boundaries. You can truly think globally. There are about 2.5 billion people today using smartphones. That number will be 3 billion by the end of this year, perhaps by the beginning of next year. By the end of the decade, they expect that number to be 5 billion people. We have 5 billion human minds connected to smartphones, able to find and search anything they're looking for. So you have potential reach that's enormous, and I want to encourage you to consider how great your reach might be and what the impact there might be. Welcome to the era of digital knowledge networks. And now in the context of that, let's try to reimagine this I-Corp's National Innovation Network project. Let's reimagine it with these dynamics in mind. So I'm going to end with a few questions here for you to consider. The first thing that we know is digital networks transform fixed media. I work in Hollywood, trust me, this is our #1 issue we're trying to grapple with. How do you deal with the demise of fixed media? It's not just books, it's also music, it's also films and tapes, and so forth. All of that stuff is gone. We don't necessarily have to sell the container anymore. We can just sell the content. The content's been liberated. It's on the digital network, but it's hard to control. It's hard to keep it under control. It's hard to make a business out of that when the information just flows quite naturally, like water or like atmosphere, through the network. And so what companies are finding they have to do is convert their business. Instead of selling products by the piece, We have to start to sell a subscription access to a service. And that requires a completely different mindset. That requires a customer service orientation that most media companies don't have. That's why they're not so successful on the web. That's the dirty secret of Hollywood. They're not in the customer care business. They let somebody else deal with that. They just make the product. But now if you're going to go direct to people on the internet, you've got to be in customer care. You've got to deal with consumers. This has happened to the game business. This has happened to the music business. This is happening to movies. Every one of these businesses is being transformed into a digital service from a business that used to sell fixed products. It's starting to happen with education and events. Here's a conference business, TED, that's created an incredible impact just by sharing videos of the talks. Suddenly, something that used to cost $5,000 to attend, you can watch those talks for free, and tens of millions of people do. LexisNexis provides a very lively business selling information about law and other information. So a question or takeaway idea for you might be this. How might we turn the I-Corp's National Innovation Network into a service? Don't think of it as a product. Think of it as a service. Who are the members in that service? How do they belong to that? How do they get that membership? Is it free? Is there a paid tier to it? How long does your membership last? What do you have to do to qualify to be a member in that service? Maybe there are different tiers of access to that service. Maybe if you begin at one level as a novice, you can mature your way through during your career and end up as a mentor for somebody else later after you've matured a little bit, progressed a little bit in your career. It's a novel way to think about it. Think of it as a time-based evolution of the membership inside of your network. If you have a network that's adaptive and can grow with the audience and grow with them as they evolve, as they progress, then I think you're going to have something that's very durable and lasts a long time. Second idea. So the books, the Gutenberg idea, this printing idea came from China. That's also the origin of intellectual property, because once you can make a book into a product that can be sold, then you had to have some laws governing the reproduction of that because print publishing became a lively business. So we now have intellectual property laws. Well, on the digital network, given the nature of the fluidity of ideas, we've adopted something rather different. The last time I spoke to this group about a year and a half ago, I talked about openness and open standards and open source software, and we explored some of the conundrums and paradoxes inside of that concept. I'm not going to recap that for you today. But I want to point to this idea of openness, because open standards drive the web, and the open sharing of information is one of the reasons why the internet has grown so rapidly in so many places around the world. It's accessible to everybody. It's democratic in the sense that everyone can participate. We're starting to see this open idea spill out of the digital network and into the real world. Open source ecology is a project that was started by a physicist who was also a farmer. He went bankrupt as a farmer, spending his money on equipment. He couldn't maintain his equipment, so he decided to open source plans for all the equipment you would need to make a farming village. And it's an open source project, so anyone can contribute. And so they have an open source tractor and an open source harvester and an open source grain silo and so forth. Today there are more than 40 industrial machines that are available. You can download the plans, and they call it a global village construction kit. This is an open source approach to hardware. And this is actually a growing idea, but it came from the digital network, and now it's spilling out into the real world. So the question for your National Innovation Network is, how might this National Innovation Network serve as a platform for open innovation, shareable ideas? That's another way to gain a great deal of traction. Now, I've talked a great deal about human connections woven into these networks and the amount of human trust that's necessary to make these networks work. Well, we all know that digital networks help us make connections. That's clear, and our phones are full of apps that help us connect with people in novel and interesting ways. The question for you today is, how is this National Innovation Network going to provide a trusted marketplace for a verified reputation? You see, right now we have a problem, and it's connected to that open idea. Open access journals have become tainted in the last few years. There are many of them. That was a great idea at first because it was a way for scientists to publish their findings. And then they started to kind of, you had to pay your way to publish business model. And so scientists would be asked to pay a few $1,000s to publish their papers, and they would get peer review. But as it turns out, the peer review doesn't always happen, and some of these journals are less than trustworthy. And some of the reviewers are non-existent. And so there's now a new need in the marketplace because we have this problem as it starts to erode the credibility of those open source journals, publication of science. Its reputation is being tarnished. I think what we need to do is find some organization needs to step forth and help us manage credentials in a way on digital networks where people are trusted. Now, a digital network is great for this because you can evaluate people by the value of their contributions. You can have sort of a peer review rank the value of the contributions. That's a concept that I encourage you to consider adding into your National Innovation Network. if there's some peer review mechanism that values people based on how they participate, how often they participate, and the quality over time of those interactions, well, then that too will translate into another form of value in this digital marketplace. So the printing press didn't just bring us books, it also bring us news. The newspaper was an idea that came about 100 years after the first printing presses were introduced. Before that, there was no news. There was no market for the news. We kind of created the market. We created the audience for the news. The news has changed tremendously. Digital networks have totally transformed the way the news business operates. Now, beginning with RSS, but now more recently, private companies have created their own version of an RSS feed. And here's obviously the Facebook feed, probably the best example, or the Twitter feed, the news feed. On those two services, we've kind of become addicted to seeing all the news that comes in. This information is filtered through our friends. They post and share information they think is going to be relevant to us. And depending on how much we share that interest, we may find this information useful and valuable to us. What's happened is now traditional publications like Time Magazine are starting to follow that news feed format because so many people have adopted it as their primary source of news. In fact, you can now create your own newspaper, your own news feed. This is my friend Richard Titus, and he publishes his own version of a newspaper just from his own browsing each morning. He posts things, and you've seen millions of people do this with things like Paperly. So we question, or I guess an idea at the core here is that curation in a world of information overload is more valuable than actually publishing information. Sometimes it's more valuable to be a curator. We do value the contributions of great original writers and great researchers, but we also have a great need for people to curate information. So that presents yet another takeaway idea for the National Innovation Network. And that idea is, how might we offer a curated news feed as a way for people to stay in touch and stay engaged? Instead of pushing outbound marketing like email marketing and so forth at people, why not give them an opt-in news feed that's filtered by the people they trust, those people with the verified reputations, whose contributions are noteworthy and worthwhile. We might find that we share an interest together. We think somebody's really smart. Their interpretation of something is really quite useful. I could see an innovation news feed emerging. Now, there's a real second benefit there for the Innovation Network, because, of course, you'll see what's being shared across the entire network. You'll see the most shared stories that are coming out. You'll see where the trends are. You'll see who's interested in what. You'll be able to form new associations. You'll be able to spot trends far before they emerge in the eyes of others. And so there's an actual information asset that will be generated. If you simply provide your membership with a tool to do a curated news feed, you'll start to glean or harvest data from that news feed. You'll be able to see how the members are using it, and you'll get an information advantage from that. That'll help you improve the service. The printing press also enabled one other thing. It enabled mass education, because in the past, as you can see in the picture on the left side of the screen, the lecture is the medieval format of learning. You would sit there and listen in a room while somebody who's educated talked to you. But with the introduction of mass production of books, we were able to now have everyone get the exact same text in front of them. So mass education became possible. So did mass literacy for the first time, mass media in general. The digital network is going to transform this. And there's a lot of ways this might work. One way is do-it-yourself conferences. We're starting to see a trend here where people are looking for ways to run miniature conferences. They just want to get some like-minded people together in a room because there's still value in meeting in person. It doesn't all have to happen on a digital network. Here, for example, is a site called EventUp, and it's a cool way to see, you can sort of browse around and see what's available as a venue in your local neighborhood. And so in my neighborhood, I was able to find, I could rent the Nokia Theater for $1,000. I could run a conference at the Nokia Theater for $1,000. Like, why not? I could put my own conference on. What a cool idea. What a great thing to do. What a great service to be able to offer to your membership so that they don't just have to meet in the digital network or fly to Washington once a year for this meeting. They can meet in person. How might this National Innovators Network facilitate do-it-yourself conferences? And while we're on the topic of education, let's rethink scale. Because your National Innovation Network is going to be aimed at a sort of ideal spot of thousands of members, thousands of participating organizations, but it won't go below that or above that. Let's think, how might we address below or above that number, that ideal number of thousands in the network? So let's rethink scale. You'll notice that there are a lot of new services that allow you to connect with video on the web. Google Plus Hangouts is one of my favorite things to use. Uvu is a way to connect 12 people simultaneously. Who needs it? I guess teenagers. And what people are starting to do is use these tools to create virtual conferences, virtual meeting places, virtual exchange of ideas. And this seems like another easy thing to bolt on to your National Innovation Network. How might you leverage video conferencing, these easy off-the-shelf tools, to enable your membership to create kind of an ad hoc conference around an idea? And yet the generation of ideas that occur within that conference, that'll be part of the context of the National Innovators Network. That could be another way for you to add value. It could be another way for your membership to gain value from it, connect with other people more efficiently. Let's flip it around. Let's think about how we might scale it up. So in the past few years, there's been a lot of controversy around the concept of MOOCs. Most major universities have dipped their toe in the ocean of online learning. Companies like Udacity and Coursera have also come in and put a little bit of momentum there because they're venture funded, so they're trying to get to scale very quickly. The first round of MOOCs were not necessarily terribly successful, but I think the principle behind it is sound, and I think you're going to see MOOC 2.0 or 3.0 come out in the future and probably work very effectively, probably as an adjunct to traditional university education, but a way to reach many more people. Thousands more will be reached because many people can't afford a college education. So how might the National Innovators Network scale up to serve millions of people? What a wonderful question to think about. How might you use the learnings from the MOOCs, from these massive online open courses? How might you extend that into your Innovators Network and start to create something that spans not just the United States, but the whole world, and enables anyone who wishes to participate to have a meaningful role and learn from the masters of innovation that you're going to attract to your network? See, I bring these things to your attention because I believe there's a crisis happening right now in the way we share information in the United States. And the crisis consists of this. Science has been politicized in the United States. You guys didn't do it, but it's happened. It's a fact. It's not a question of right or left or Democrat or Republican. The fact is science has been politicized. And the impact of it is quite terrible. We have more scientific information, more research available than ever in history, and yet people have less trust in science. We're skeptical about science, and it's partly because it's been politicized. And so we find that most Americans disagree with mainstream scientists on topics that seem perfectly obvious outside the United States. Climate change, GMO foods. People are at odds with scientists on these topics. A third of Americans think that vaccines cause autism. We know this isn't true. All of this relates to some faulty research done by Dr. Andrew Wakefield. It was published in the UK. Research that was so poorly done, it was so fraudulent, that his license to practice medicine was taken away from him, and he was kicked out of the UK. He left the UK, moved to the United States. But yet, despite that great shame, this myth persists that somehow vaccines cause autism, and we keep seeing the same meme pop up again and again and again. Trying to stop it, it's like playing whack-a-mole. Well, if you think that's bad, how about this? A quarter of the population doesn't even realize that the Earth revolves around the sun. So we have some work to do. I think the weak spot in a knowledge network is the human beings, unfortunately, because every generation of them has to be educated, and they're subject to making the same exact fallacies and falling prey to the same folklore as the previous generation. So it's a constant process of re-educating. And so here is a great question for you to take away. How might a national innovation network restore public trust in science? What an awesome, what an epic task. What a great undertaking that would be. And so it's with that thought in mind, I'm going to wrap up my comments here. Thank you very much for your time.